Hello everyone, welcome to this series of videos produced by the Faculty of Dentistry, University of Khartoum. This is Wathir Al-Fatih Idris, a teaching assistant of anatomy at the Department of Basic Medical Sciences, Faculty of Dentistry, University of Khartoum. In the previous sessions, we've dealt with the osteology of the head and neck, and in the next two sessions, I'm going to deal with the soft tissues of the neck, dividing the neck into two triangles by the key muscle of the neck, anterior and posterior triangles. So let's start. Here I'm going to use the Netta Anatomical Flashcards, the 5th edition. In this diagram, one can see that the neck is divided by the key muscle, as we have previously mentioned in the last practical, the sternocleidomastoid, which divides the neck here into two triangles, the anterior triangle with the base being located upwards and the apex downwards. And here is the posterior triangle lying posterior to it. Here is the base, which is located inferiorly, and the apex is located upwards. The boundaries of this triangle are as follows. The anterior boundary is made by the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. The posterior one is the anterior border of the trapezius muscle. Here is the trapezius muscle. The base is made by the middle third of the clavicle here, and the apex is located upwards here at the superior nuchal line in the gap between the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. The roof of this triangle is made by the investing layer of deep cervical fascia, while the floor is made by the prevertebral fascia plastering down the prevertebral muscles. And those muscles that make the floor are from above downwards here. One can see this muscle, which is known as the semispinalis capitis, splenius capitis. Low down is the levator scapulae. Here one can see the three scalene muscles: scalenus posterior, scalenus medius, and scalenus anterior. The major three muscles that form the floor are the splenius capitis, the levator scapulae, and scalenus medius. However, depending on the size of the sternocleidomastoid and the level of the drooping of the shoulder, scalenus anterior and the first digitation of serratus anterior might be present here at the base, while at the apex one can see the semispinalis capitis. So the floor might be formed of 5 muscles. These are semispinalis capitis, splenius capitis, levator scapulae, scalene muscles, and the first digitation of serratus anterior. Now we should move to the cadaver to show those muscles and the boundaries of this triangle. So now showing the boundaries of the posterior triangle and the cadaver specimen. The boundaries are as follows. Here is the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and here is the trapezius muscle. The boundaries are as follows. The anterior boundary of the triangle is made by the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, while the posterior boundary is made by the anterior border of the trapezius muscle. Okay. The base of the triangle here is made by the middle third of the clavicle, while the apex is located upwards here at the base of the skull, at the superior nuchal line in the gap between the attachment of the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid here. The roof, as I've said, is formed by the investing layer of deep cervical fascia, which is being removed in order to free these muscles. And the floor is made by mainly 3 muscles. These are this one, which is the splenius capitis. Lower to this is the levator scapulae, and more inferiorly here one can see scalenus medius. However, depending on the size of the sternocleidomastoid and the degree of the drooping of the shoulder, other muscles might be present low down. These are the scalenus anterior and the first digitation of serratus anterior muscle. And high up here, another muscle might be present, which is the semispinalis capitis. So in this triangle or in this neck, the floor is made by these prevertebral muscles plastered down by the prevertebral fascia. The first one here is the semispinalis capitis, then low down is the splenius capitis, below which we have the levator scapulae, the muscle which is heading downwards towards the scapula, the levator scapulae muscle. And then we have the three scalene muscles, scalenus posterior, scalenus medius, and here is scalenus anterior. So semispinalis capitis, splenius capitis, levator scapulae, scalenus posterior, scalenus medius, and scalenus anterior, making the floor of the posterior triangle. So you can see here, one of the contents of the posterior triangle is this muscle. This is the inferior belly of omohyoid crossing the lower part, the lower and medial part of the posterior triangle. And thus it divides this posterior triangle into a smaller lower part, which is known as the supraclavicular part, and a larger upper part, and this is known as the occipital triangle. That's all about the boundaries and the divisions of the posterior triangle of the neck. This station deals with the cervical plexus, which is a network formed by the anterior primary rami of the upper four cervical spinal nerves after each has received gray ramus communicants from the sympathetic trunk. This plexus gives rise to a number of branches. There is a group which is concerned with the supply of cutaneous structures or the skin of the neck, as well as the back of the neck, as well as the anterior and the lateral sides, the face, and descends downward also to supply to participate in the supply of the skin overlying the chest, and these are known as the cutaneous branches. It also gives rise to muscular branches and meningeal branches. This flashcard here shows the cutaneous branches as they emerge from the middle of the from beneath the middle of the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Here are these cutaneous branches. These are four. The first one here is known as the lesser occipital branch. This originates from the second cervical spinal nerve, and it ascends upwards along the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid to reach the back of the neck, the posterior superior part of the neck, as well as the scalp. So it supplies the skin overlying the posterior superior part of the neck, the scalp, as well as supplies here a small part of the medial surface of the auricular skin. The second one is the great auricula. This is the great auricular nerve. It originates from the second and the third cervical spinal nerve, anterior rami. It ascends upwards obliquely across the lateral surface of sternocleidomastoid muscle, and it's distributed to an area of skin overlying the angle of the mandible, and also it supplies the parotid fascia and overlying the skin. It supplies almost the whole of the medial surface of the auricular skin, with a small contribution from the lesser occipital, and also it supplies the skin overlying the lower half of the lateral surface of the auricular skin below the external acoustic meatus. So this is the great auricular nerve. The third branch, as can be seen here, this is known as the transverse cervical nerve, with a root value of C2 and C3, but mainly C3. It originates here beneath the midpoint of the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. Then it crosses almost transversely across the lateral surface of the sternocleidomastoid, and then it divides into two, an ascending and descending branch. Okay, this branch supplies the anterior aspect of skin overlying the anterior aspect of the neck, extending from the chin as far downward as the sternum. The fourth one is this branch, and this is known as the supraclavicular nerve, with a root value of C3 and C4. It descends downward along the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, and then it divides into three groups. The most anterior one is known as the medial group. Then we have the intermediate, and the most lateral one here is the lateral group. The anterior group descends, or the medial group descends downward and supplies the skin of the anterior aspect of the chest from the upper border of the sternum as far downward as the sternal angular fluid, while the intermediate group supplies skin overlying the side of the thorax as far downward as the second rib. The lateral group supplies the skin overlying the side, the lateral aspect of the arm, as far downward as the midpoint of the deltoid muscle, and also it has got branches that passes backward to supply skin of the back as far downward as the scapular spine. So these are the cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus. In order to revise them, this is the lesser occipital nerve, this is the greater orbicular, this is the transverse cervical, and the last one here is the supraclavicular nerve. This diagram shows the muscular branches of the cervical plexus, but before proceeding to the muscular branches, one can see the roots of the plexus here between the ischialinus anterior and ischialinus medius are the roots of the cervical plexus, lying in rows or in series with the roots of the brachial plexus here. This is C2 and this is C3, while this is C4. C1 is not evident here. So this is C2, C3, and C4 roots located between ischialinus anterior and ischialinus medius muscle. Now, moving to the muscular branches, C1 gives the superior root of the ansa cervicalis. The ansa cervicalis is a loop here. Okay, it lies in front of the internal jugular vein. Okay, this is the superior root of the ansa cervicalis, and this is the inferior root. The superior root is also known as the descendens hypoglossae. It originates from the first cervicospinal nerve. However, it hitchhikes or travels along the hypoglossal nerve, and it's given here in front of the internal carotid artery and descends downward over the common carotid artery to meet its fellow, the descendens cervicalis, or the inferior root of the ansa cervicalis. Okay, this ansa cervicalis gives, or this loop gives, a number of branches that supply the infrahyoid muscles that have been hooked together with the anterior triangle. Okay, the inferior root originates from the second and the third roots of the cervical plexus, from C2 and C3, and winds around the lateral border of the internal jugular vein to meet the descendens hypoglossae. The other branches are segmental branches from the roots of the cervical plexus to the prevertebral muscles here, as well as to the sternocleidomastoid. Here is the branch of the sternocleidomastoid, and to the trapezius muscle. However, these branches to the trapezius and to the sternocleidomastoid are proprioceptive and not motor. The most important of these muscular branches is the phrenic nerve. Here is the phrenic, which descends downwards over the ischialinus anterior muscle. This nerve originates from the third, the fourth, and the fifth roots of the cervical spinal nerves. So it originates from C2. Okay, this is the branch from C2. From C3, here this is the branch from C3, and this is the branch from C4. It originates mainly C5. This is C3, C4, and C5. It originates mainly from C3. From C4, it descends downwards vertically around the obliquity of the ischialinus anterior from its medial border to from its lateral border to its medial border, then descends downward behind the subclavian vein. This nerve is the most important of the muscular branches because it's the only motor supplied to its own half of the diaphragm. Also, it gives sensory branches to the mediastinum and to the pleura and the peritoneum. That's all for the muscular branches of the cervical plexus. Here in this station, we're going to see the roots of the cervical plexus and some of the muscular branches. The cutaneous branches cannot be seen because this is a deep dissection of the neck. They have been removed during the dissection. As I have previously mentioned, that The roots of the cervical plexus are not located within the confines of the posterior triangle. They're located between the scalene, anterior, and medius muscles. So in order to see them, I'm going to retract the sternocleidomastoid muscle upwards, as well as retracting the omohyoid muscle. Okay, here this is the scalenus medius muscle, while this is the scalenus anterior one. The roots of the cervical plexus are located between these two muscles. This is C1 root. Yes, this is C1 root of the cervical plexus. This is C2. Here is C3, and this is C4. So C1, C2, C3, and C4 lying in a line parallel with those of the brachial plexus that will be known later. One of the muscular branches here can be seen is one of the roots of the ansa cervicalis. Okay, supplying, given a branch to supply one of the infrahyoid muscles. This is the sternothyroid muscle. The other muscular branch seen here is this one. This is the most important. Okay, this is the phrenic nerve. Okay, this is the phrenic nerve, descending downward behind the subclavian vein in order to supply its own half of the diaphragm. That's all what's evident or what's apparent here in this section, the roots as well as these only two muscular branches. Now, moving to the next station. Now in this station we move to talk about nerves found in the supraclavicular part of the posterior triangle, and these are the trunks of the brachial plexus. So what is the brachial plexus? The brachial plexus is a loop or a network of nerves formed by the anterior primary rabi of the 5th cervical spinal nerve through the 8th cervical spinal nerve, in addition to the 1st thoracic spinal nerve. The roots of these nerves are located between the anterior and the posterior, between scalenus anterior and scalenus medius, thus not within the posterior triangle. These roots, as you can see here, as we said, it's made by C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1, the 1st thoracic spinal nerve. The roots then unite in order to form trunks here, and the trunks then divide into anterior and posterior divisions, and these divisions reunite in order to form cords. So the plexus, this brachial plexus, is made of roots, trunks, divisions, and then cords, and the cords will give rise to branches, and these branches are directed mainly to supply the muscles and the skin of the upper limb. Let's see, here is C5 and C6, so the upper two roots unite in order to form the upper trunk here. The middle root, which is C7, continues as the middle trunk, and the lower two roots, C8 and T1, unite together in order to form the lower trunk. So thus, each trunk then divides into two divisions. Anterior, this is the anterior, and this is the posterior division of the upper trunk, the anterior and posterior division of the middle, and this is the posterior and the anterior division of the lower trunk. The anterior divisions of the upper and the lower trunk here, the anterior divisions of the upper and the lower trunks, unite together in order to form the lateral cord, while the anterior division here of the lower trunk continues as the medial cord, and the posterior divisions of all three trunks unite in order to form the posterior cord. So this is the lateral cord formed by the anterior divisions of the upper and the middle trunks. The medial cord is formed by the anterior division of the lower cord of the lower trunk, and the posterior cord here is made by the posterior divisions of the upper, middle, and lower trunks. The roots of the brachial plexus give rise to certain branches. C5 or the fifth cervical spinal nerve gives rise to a branch from its posterior aspect. This is known as the dorsal scapular nerve that accompanies the dorsal scapular arteries, as will be seen later. The fifth and the sixth cervical roots will give rise from their anterior aspects to a branch. This branch goes downwards to supply the subclavius muscle, while the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh here, these roots will contribute to the formation of this branch, which is known as the long thoracic nerve that descends downward to supply serratus anterior. So the trunks are the only parts of the brachial plexus that can be seen in the posterior triangle, and these trunks have got only one branch. This branch originates from the superior trunk, usually at the junction of the C5 and C6 roots here, and this is known as the suprascapular nerve that will accompany the suprascapular artery to supply the muscles of the scapula, the posterior aspect of the scapula. So this is all for the brachial plexus, and we will move to see the parts of which that are found within the posterior triangle in the cadaver. Here we move to the cadaver to see the respective parts of the brachial plexus within the posterior triangle. Here I'm going to retract the sternocleidomastoid muscle upwards and laterally, and also I'm going to retract the omohyoid muscle in order to show the parts of the brachial plexus. As I've previously mentioned, that the roots of the brachial plexus are not present within the posterior triangle. They are located between the scalenus anterior here and the scalenus medius more posteriorly. The roots of the brachial plexus I've seen are, I've said these are C5, this is C6, now this is C7, and here we have C8 with a contribution from T1. So this is C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. The upper two roots unite in order to form the upper trunk, while the middle root or C7 continues as the middle trunk. And here C7 and C8 and T1 unite in order to form the lower trunk. So this is the upper trunk, this is the middle, and this is the lower trunk. And the trunks are the parts of the brachial plexus that are located within the posterior triangle, after which they divide beneath or behind the clavicle into anterior and posterior divisions. We're not concerned with them here. Only one of the branches from the roots. We have got three branches from the roots. These are the subclavius, nerve to subclavius, dorsal scapular, long thoracic nerves. Only the nerve to subclavius is present here. We can see it. This is the nerve to the subclavius muscle originating from the from the fifth and the sixth roots of the brachial plexus. The only branch from the trunks of the brachial plexus can be seen here. This one. This is the suprascapular nerve, which originates from, this is the suprascapular nerve, which originates from the upper trunk of the brachial plexus, going upwards and downwards and laterally, accompanied by an artery of the same name. We'll know it later. It's a branch of the subclavian artery. So this is the part of the brachial plexus that is located within the posterior triangle. Now we move to the next station. Now this station is concerned with showing the vessels of the posterior triangle. These vessels are merely the branches of the subclavian artery. The subclavian artery is divided into three parts by the scalenus anterior muscle. The scalenus anterior extends downwards laterally and divides the artery into a medial part. The one that lies medial to it is the first part. The one that lies posterior to it is the second part, and the one that lies lateral to it is the third part, after which it becomes the axillary artery beyond the outer border of the first rib. Now here is the first part of the subclavian artery. It gives rise to three branches. The first of them is the one that ascends upwards here. This is the vertebral artery. It passes upwards through the foramen transversarium of the 6th cervical vertebrae and continues upwards. The second one is this one. This is known as the thyrocervical trunk. This trunk, as it emerges from its upper convexity, it divides soon into the inferior thyroid artery. This is the inferior thyroid artery that makes a loop behind the carotid sheath to supply the thyroid, the lower part of the thyroid gland, and also gives here to an artery that ascends upwards, and this is known as the ascending cervical artery, which supplies the prevertebral muscle segmentally. The second branch of this thyrocervical trunk is the transverse cervical artery here that passes laterally, running in the within the posterior triangle. This branch might also be called as the superficial cervical artery if it gives another branch. This is known as the dorsal-scapular artery. The third branch of this trunk is the suprascapular artery that passes also laterally within the posterior triangle to supply the muscles at the back of the scapula. Here is the suprascapular artery. The third branch of this ferrous part originates from its inferior aspect and descends downward lateral to the lateral border of the sternum, and its supply is known as the internal thoracic artery, which supplies the anterior body wall. So the three branches that originate from the first part are the vertebral artery, the thyrocervical trunk, and the internal thoracic artery. The thyrocervical trunk divides into three: the inferior thyroid, the transverse cervical or the superficial cervical artery, and the suprascapular artery. The second part here, the second part of the artery gives rise to the costocervical trunk. It gives only a single branch. This is the costocervical trunk, which passes backwards, and then it divides into an ascending branch. This is the deep cervical. And a descending one, this is the superior intercostal artery, which gives rise to the posterior intercostal arteries of the upper two intercostal spaces. The third division here of the subclavian artery does not give rise into any branch. However, sometimes from its deep aspect, it might give rise to the dorsal-scapular artery if it has not emerged from the transverse cervical artery. So this is the first part. The second part here, which gives rise only to the costocervical, and the third part, which usually doesn't give rise to any branch except for the dorsal scapula if it has not emerged from the transverse cervical artery. That's all for this diagram. Now we're going to move to the cadaver in order to show these branches. So let's move. Finally, we're about to finish our practical by now going to talk about the supraclavicular part of the posterior triangle here, this part, which lies below the inferior belly of digastric muscle. And this mainly contains the the subclavian artery. Okay. In order to show this artery, we have to remove the sternocleidomastoid and the omohyoid muscle. The key muscle to the subclavian artery is the scalenus anterior muscle. The scalenus anterior passes downward in front of the subclavian artery to be inserted into the clavicle here. The clavicle has been removed. This scalene muscle divides the artery into three parts. As I have shown in the flashcard. The part that lies medial is the first part here. The part that lies posterior to the muscle here is the second part, and the part that lies lateral is the third part. So now I'm going to remove to retract the scalenus anterior muscle. here is the first part of the artery. It gives rise to 3 branches. The first one is the vertebral artery here. This artery ascends upwards in this space, which is known as the pyramidal space, and then it enters, it enters the transverse process of C6 and those above. The second one, which also originates from the upper convexity of the subclavian artery, is this branch. This is known as the thyrocervical trunk. It's known as the thyrocervical trunk because it gives branches to the neck and as well as to the thyroid. The thyroid part is the inferior thyroid artery. This is the inferior thyroid artery, which ascends upwards. It passes deep to the carotid sheath, forming a loop here in order to reach the inferior aspect of the thyroid gland. It also gives branches to the muscles of the neck. This is the ascending cervical artery, provided by this ascending cervical artery. And finally, it gives also branches to the viscera of the neck, which are the trachea and the esophagus, the larynx, and the cervical part of the pharynx. The pharynx and the cervical part of the esophagus. The second branch from this thyrocervical trunk is the one that passes outwards and backwards. This is the transverse cervical artery or the superficial cervical artery. The third branch is this one, which is the suprascapular artery, which passes laterally backwards towards the scapula. So the branches from the thyrocervical trunk are the inferior thyroid artery, the transverse cervical artery, and the suprascapular artery. The third and the last branch from the first part of the subclavian artery originates from its inferior aspect here. This branch is known as the internal thoracic artery. The internal thoracic artery extends downwards, lateral to the side of the sternum to supply the anterior body wall. So these 3 branches are the branches of the first part: the vertebral, the thyrocervical trunk, and here is the internal thoracic or the internal mammary artery. Branches from the second part lies deep to the scanulus anterior muscle. It has got only a single branch. Here we can see it. This is known as the costocervical trunk, which emanates from the posterior aspect of the subclavian artery. This is the costocervical trunk, which ascends upwards, and then it soon divides into 2 parts. The ascending one is known as the deep cervical artery, while the one that passes posteriorly here is the superior intercostal artery that provides the supply for the posterior aspect of the first 2 intercostal spaces. It gives rise to the first 2 posterior intercostal arteries. The third part of the subclavian artery usually has got no branch, but sometimes it might give to a branch from its posterior aspect, and this is known as the dorsal-scapular artery. This artery accompanies the nerve of the same name and goes backwards in order to supply some of the muscles of the back. However, this dorsal-scapular artery usually originates from the transverse cervical artery, and in this instance, it's known as the superficial. The transverse is called as the superficial cervical artery. So this is the first part, this is the second part of the artery, and this is the third part. The first part has got, in order to summarize, has got 3 parts. This is the vertebral, this is the thyrocervical, and this is the internal thoracic or the internal mammary artery. The second part has got a single branch. This is known as the costocervical trunk, which soon divides into 2 branches, the deep cervical and the superior intercostal artery, and the third part usually has got no branch. That's all for the subclavian artery. The subclavian vein is located well below the subclavian artery, and in front of the attachment of the scalene muscle. Thus, the subclavian vein is not a part of the posterior triangle. Okay, the supraclavicular part of the posterior triangle also contains the lower part of the externa jugular vein. This is the externa jugular vein crossing the lateral aspect of the sternocleidomastoid, and then it pierces the roof of the posterior triangle to drain, being a part of the posterior triangle contents, to drain into the subclavian vein. So the contents of the supraclavicular part are lymph nodes. Okay, these are the supraclavicular lymph nodes, as well as the subclavian artery and its branches, and the lower part of the external jugular vein draining into the subclavian vein downwards. That's all for the supraclavicular part of the posterior triangle. Thank you very much, and now our practice has come to an end. See you later.